Hi, I'm Dr. Avanti Singh. In over 20 years of practicing both Western medicine and Eastern healing traditions, the most important thing that I've learned is that healing is a journey we take together. So on this podcast, I'll be demystifying Ayurveda and other integrated medicine, showing how these simple, ancient practices are the keys to unlocking a healthy modern life. We are all healing catalysts because healing starts within. It starts with you, and it starts right now. Episode number 135. Well, hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to the Healing Catalyst podcast. Today, we have an incredible episode. We are talking about narcissism. Why narcissism? Because it is everywhere. And we all have people in our life or people that we know that fit this description. And if you're thinking, nah, I don't hang out with narcissists, keep listening. Because I'm willing to bet that you know a narcissist. You work with one, you're friends with one, you have a family member who's one, or you're in an intimate relationship with one. And how do I know this? Well, let me give you some scenarios, and I think you'll see why. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone who always makes every topic about them? Or maybe you know someone who only calls you when they need something. Or maybe you know someone who always makes everything your fault. Maybe you know someone who ghosts you for days after a date and then texts you out of the blue just to say hello. Or maybe you text someone after a date and they text you back saying that you're needy. And I could go on and on and on with examples. And I'm willing to bet that you were shaking your head yes to at least one of those examples. Chances are you know a narcissist, but maybe you're not exactly sure. Well, don't worry. Today, I'm joined by the world's leading expert on narcissism, Dr. Ramani Durvasula, and she's going to answer all of your questions. Dr. Ramani is a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles, professor emerita of psychology at California State University, and the founder, CEO of Luna Education, Training, and Consulting. She's also the author of several books, including her most recent, which was an instant New York Times bestseller, It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. The focus of Dr. Ramani's clinical, academic, and consultative work is the etiology and impact of narcissism and high conflict, antagonistic personality styles on human relationships, mental health, and societal expectations. Her work has been featured at South by Southwest, TEDx, Red Table Talk, The Today Show, and Investigation Discovery. In our conversation, Dr. Ramani breaks down how we feel if we're in a narcissistic relationship, helping us understand the intricate patterns of narcissism, the emotional and physiological toll it takes, and why so many of us find ourselves trapped in toxic cycles. We also discuss the telltale signs of narcissistic behavior and the narcissistic relationship cycle, from love bombing and devaluation to the discard and hoovering phases. We also explore why we stay in these relationships and the practical steps to heal and rebuild our sense of self. Dr. Ramani also shares insights on recognizing early warning signs, setting and maintaining boundaries, and the importance of radical acceptance, a strong support system, and the power of validating voices in healing from narcissistic people. This is such an incredibly important episode. I ask that if you get something out of this, or if you have a friend or a family member who is struggling with or has struggled with a narcissist in their life, please share this with them. What they learn in this episode could literally change their life, because this conversation is essential for anyone who's seeking to understand narcissistic behavior in relationships and reclaim their power. I am so honored to bring you my conversation with Dr. Ramani Durvasula, who gives us insight into the Narcissist's Playbook and how to heal from narcissistic relationships. Hi, Dr. Ramani. I am so excited to meet you. Thanks for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I have been following your work and I'm so excited for you, your new book. It's Not You, New York Times bestseller. Super exciting. So
Thank
excited for
you.
you. It's awesome. It's awesome. It's probably been a whirlwind for you.
It was a whirlwind, and the whirlwind is starting to settle, I'm happy to say. So
That's
it's
good.
good. Yeah,
Good,
thank
good.
you.
Well, I think it's great and it's good because I think this is information that so many people need. So, I spent some time reading your book and I was really struck by something that I really kind of want to dive into, which is, you dive into all the complexities of narcissism. This is your area of research and study for
Mhm.
so many years, and this is sort of your specialty. And what I found so interesting was that you really flipped the script because coming from medicine, right? All the studies,
Mhm.
all the papers are always about the narcissist, the
Yes.
personality traits of the narcissist, the signs, which I think are all important. But
Yes.
I would really love for us to talk about, you know, what you might be feeling as the other person, because I mean, your book is called It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic Individuals. So it's really about the other person in the relationship. So
Mhm.
I'm really curious, what are some of the things that you might be feeling if you are in a relationship with a narcissist and you don't even realize it?
Mhm. You feel confused, exhausted, depleted, anxious, powerless, helpless. You're ruminating all the time. There's a lot of regret, shame, grief, sadness, and other negative emotions.
Yeah.
There is a sense that you're to blame for what happened. People in these relationships become very hyper vigilant. They often find themselves continuing to walk on eggshells, even when the narcissistic relationship may end, and so especially if it doesn't. And we
Mhm.
even see some physiological fallout. We see difficulties with sleep. We see a whole host of sort of physiological illnesses. We see an uptick in autoimmune, that
Mhm.
level of stress circulating in a person with no resolution. We may see greater vulnerability to getting sick. And we just sort of see this constant sense of fatigue and exhaustion that can't just be explained away by issues around sleep. It's like a stress that never goes away, and
Mhm.
it's a stress that can't be acted on. Whereas other things might be like prioritize your tasks, wake up a little earlier,
Mhm.
lay your clothes out the night before, get some exercise. None of that is going to move the needle one bit in these relationships. And so the stress persists. And for the longest time, people were never given an explanation and given nonsense explanations like it takes two to tango and relationships are work and relationships are sacrifice and why don't you look at your contribution? And that's really why I started doing this work. But it really takes a huge toll on people.
Yeah, I mean, because so many of the things that you explained or sort of described just now could be so many things that people could be going through. I mean, I
Mhm.
think there are so many of us walking around every day feeling a lot of those symptoms, a lot of those
Mhm.
signs. So, like, how do you start to tease apart if it's really a relationship issue with a narcissist versus generalized anxiety disorder or just, being in a hypervigilant state or just living in the world as a human these days, right? How do you start to tease that apart?
Couple of things. I mean, number one, people often will say, I don't feel comfortable in this, whatever this relationship is. It might be a
Mm,
primary, it might be an intimate relationship, it might be a family relationship. People will say there's a sort of sense of dread around the relationship and they feel guilty about that dread. They dread when they have to go home at the end of the day or sense that person is coming home at the end of the day. They dread having to talk to that person. They dread having to see that person. So that's one piece of it. Number two, what we do see is when it's only, when I say only, I put only in quotes, when it's largely due to the narcissistic relationship and not due to some sort of psychiatric issue being sort of in the prime seat,
right.
you will see that these are people who are actually functioning quite well outside of the relationship. So they'll
Mhm.
say, when I'm not with this person, I'm at work,
Yeah.
I'm with my friends, I'm with healthy people, I'm actually good. Like I'm getting things done. They'll say, gosh, they went out of town for a week and I felt like a different person. You would not see that very quick pivot if this had sort of more, this had roots in a sort of a generalized anxiety or a major
Sure.
depressive presentation. An
Mhm.
external stimulus wouldn't flip the script that quickly. And then it's the confusion, right? Because people with generalized anxiety feel a chronic sort of low grade sense of worry all the time. They
Right.
don't necessarily feel confused, right?
Mm.
People who are depressed feel sad, they feel energy depleted, they might feel irritable, but they don't feel confused.
Right.
And it is the confusion that is often at the core of like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Whereas a person who's anxious might say like, be constantly expressing worry and anxiety and however that might manifest in their life. But it's not this sense of what exactly am I doing wrong? But you can definitely see it's a bit of a dose-response relationship.
Sure.
If we were to remove the narcissistic person or persons from this person's life, or the amount they had to interact with them, in many, not all, but in many cases, we'd see almost immediate improvement. And if that's the case, then that seems to me it's that. And I think it becomes less of an issue of sort of chasing our tails on what the etiology of it is that if a person's like, I'm not feeling my best, but most people who come to this conclusion will say, there's something not right in this relationship. I don't feel, so they won't usually come to this utterance, but it's really an expression of, I don't feel safe in this relationship. I hold back in this relationship. I'm deeply inhibited in this relationship. Or they're constantly betrayed in that relationship. And the problem is that we think of trauma in a relationship only to come from physical abuse. A person is hit, a person is forced into having sexual relations. We'll clock that as a trauma.
Sure.
But what we don't tend to sort of process as a trauma when we're talking with someone is the chronic emotional neglect and invalidation. But as that piles up over the years, that's definitely trauma because that person feels less safe in the world. So I think it's very clear, having worked with people, first of all, there's usually no discernible relationship in a person who might have this presentation. Like, for example, they might be very anxious and all of that, but without a relationship, will say, I'm not in a relationship, or my parents are dead, or I perfectly, my parents have been very supportive. So there's definitely something you can pin it to as soon as you start digging deeper. And keep in mind too, these things can co-occur.
Right.
So many people with narcissistic relationships, this may have gone on to sort of culminate in a presentation like generalized anxiety or a major depressive episode. Some people have had such a sustained exposure to narcissistic abuse that we see complex trauma. And so multiple presentations are happening at the same time. And for some people, the psychiatric issue may have predated the narcissistic relationship. They may have been a person with any number of psychiatric issues that then meets a narcissistic person. And then you'll see a worsening in the symptomatology.
Yeah. So it's really complex. So, I mean, what you're saying is that it could be one or the other. It could be both. It could be which one came first. Right. And so I want to tap into something that you said, which is, that a lot of times trauma and abuse is always seen as physical or sexual and not so much emotional. The other thing I would say is that so many people are always so focused on the relationship with an intimate partner as being the person who might be the narcissist, if they're aware, or, if they're talking to their friends or their sister or their brother or whatever. It's always focused on an intimate relationship, but I know that that's not the only source. So can you talk to us about some of the other sources? Because I imagine that some of this maybe presents a little bit differently for the person in that relationship. If it's a parent, or if it's in an aunt and an uncle, or a grandparent, or perhaps in a professional setting. Let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people, suffer in these relationships that are not an intimate relationship.
Yeah. So intimate relationships, and this is basically based on a straw poll of the, thousands of survivors we've worked on. Intimate relationships tend to be the leader in this path. Like, this is what most people will report being sort of primary issue. However, and we also know that the fallout of narcissistic abuse in terms of mental health symptomatology, when it is an intimate partner, tends to be at the highest level, which makes sense because the interactions one has to have with an intimate relationship are in the day-to-day. However, pick a person in your life who's significant. If they're narcissistic, it's going to cause you problems. Obviously, with parents, it is developmentally impactful, right? Because this kind of invalidation and subjugation is going to impact the development of identity, of self-regulation, of self-concept, of self-worth. And so those wounds can actually carry through a lifetime and can be magnified if you have to continue dealing with that narcissistic parent. I always liken the adult child of a narcissistic parent is still rolling up to that parent at the age of 45, hoping that they look at the drawing they made, but now it's a promotion, or I was just promoted to partner. And the parent often still has the same indifference or even competitiveness, the same way they did when the person was a child. So and again, the criticism, the invalidation, the not enoughness, the guilt, you owe me something. that tends to persist with narcissistic parents. Narcissistic siblings can be a real issue. And what's interesting about narcissistic siblings is, again, not every child in a family system is going to become narcissistic, even though it has a developmental trajectory. There's a lot of things that go into someone becoming narcissistic. So a person could have a narcissistic sibling, not be narcissistic themselves. And that relationship can be very problematic.
Sure.
Not only might it have been a source of harm in childhood, but as that person goes into adulthood, this narcissistic sibling could be quite controlling, could be violating boundaries, could be triangulating in the family system. And as parents get older, you might see really, really inappropriate behavior around trusts, estates, wills, the care of elder parents, the elder parents' assets, all of that. And then, of course, there's a whole range of extended family members. And there's, of course, also in-laws who may not come into someone's life until later on. But a person might either A, have a narcissistic spouse who also has narcissistic parents, and that's a double nightmare, or they might be a perfectly lovely spouse, but have narcissistic parents. And that becomes a lot more tricky because they are your spouse's parents, but they could be doing all kinds of havoc, including having sort of a very sort of inappropriate enmeshedness with their own child and recognizing the new spouse as an interloper. Then you have the whole world of narcissistic workplaces. And I cannot put too fine a point on that. We often spend most of our waking hours at work. And so depending on the nature of your workplace, for example, how much contact you have with a narcissistic person, how much decision-making heft they've got, how large the workplace is, how many other healthy colleagues you might have, this can be incredibly impactful. And I have to say that I have seen people suffer at the same level you'd see with an intimate partner in a workplace. And because some people can't just afford to quit a job, they may get stuck into it, or they might have become vested, or they might be in it for a long time, or might be 2 years from retirement or something, and have to spend even more time and really, really be harmed and abused. And most HR departments don't understand anything about narcissistic relationships. So friends, narcissistic friendships, you can't, you can't even diminish the value of that, in the sense that narcissistic friendships may be friends that people have had since childhood or high school. And there's a nostalgia that keeps people in, and a guilt like, oh, they've seen me through all these things, and people might fight for it. And then narcissistic friends can do a real number on someone, especially when a person may not already have a narcissistic partner or any partner. So the friend then becomes a very primary relationship. So it can show up anywhere. It can do harm anywhere. It just turns out that much of the work has been done on intimate relationships because of things like divorce and co-parenting and all of that.
Sure. No, I think that, absolutely. I think that everything that I've ever read and anybody that I've come across in my clinical work, it's usually been an intimate partner. But I do think that this happens so often. I actually have someone in my life who has been in a workplace setting for a very long time with a very narcissistic partner. And the effect of that narcissistic partner in a workplace on this person has just been absolutely incredible for me to witness and to see, almost to the point of what a narcissistic parent is like, because this individual also has narcissistic parents. So, it's just really interesting. And I just want to make sure that, we really tap into that for folks who are listening, that this can be in any relationship that you have, that it could be coming from.
Absolutely. Not only can it be in any relationship, it's also unusual for people to just have one. It's not unusual for a person to have grown up with narcissistic parents and then find themselves with a narcissistic spouse, or have a narcissistic spouse and then maybe run into it in a narcissistic friend. Blessed are those who have none of these, but many people have more than one. And it may not be, they may not be happening contemporaneously at the same time. It may be that a person looks back and like, I can't believe I'm doing this again, right? Like I just went through this with this person and now it's this person. So I think that when it is repeated like that, it's not always that people say, I've got more skills to deal with it. There's actually this sort of exhaustion over time.
Right. Okay, I'm going to get to that because I have a question about that, which I'll come back to. But before we go there, I want to ask this, is that what keeps someone then in a narcissistic relationship besides, being in a workplace? Let's go back to intimate relationships, right? That's the biggest, piece of the pie here. What keeps someone in a narcissistic relationship, or a relationship with a narcissistic person, if they're feeling so bad and so confused? Like, what's sort of the psychology there of why we stay?
There's sort of 3 pathways to why people stay. Actually, 4 pathways to why people stay. Okay. Some of them are historical factors within ourselves that make us more vulnerable to getting stuck. And these could be anything ranging from having had narcissistic parents, having had a history of trauma, but also other stuff like having a tendency to be incredibly, almost hyper empathic, or always believing in forgiveness, or being a rescuer, or being very optimistic. These sorts of individual factors can actually make people more vulnerable to getting stuck, because there might just, in a general way, be a lot of excuse making. There might be a greater propensity for things like self-blame. And this might also be very familiar. Like, this is what relationships are. Who's going to question this? So that's one set of things that are historic within the person who's stuck. The second set of issues has to do with not knowing. We're not taught this. We're not taught this in school. I have to tell you, I don't think the word narcissism was uttered once in all my years of clinical training, classroom training, hospital training. It just wasn't mentioned. It wasn't a thing. And when we learned about it, we got all this convoluted gobbledygook, and we didn't cut to the chase. And so the fact is that if the therapists don't know, I don't know why we would expect people to know. Obviously, that's changing. There's a lot more different ways to get education about this out there, but a lot of people just don't know. And so the baseline is like, maybe I'm reading this wrong, or maybe relationships are just hard. We're all given this message. Relationships are hard. Relationships are sacrifice. Actually, no, they're not. And that's a really bad bill of goods to sell people. The relationship is functional. It's not hard. It's you. Every so often we might need a tweak and say, oh, there's someone else in the room. But that might actually speak more to the stressful way we live our lives, and not that relationships are hard. I think life and the way our economy is set up is hard. And relationships are some of the roadkill on that. It's not that the relationships are hard. So it's the not knowing, and that can be an eye-opener. Then there were the practical factors: money, minor children, religion, culture, duty, obligation, that are built into those cultural models. So there are people, I cannot tell you how many people I've sat across and said, listen, if this person dropped dead tomorrow, I'd cry the tears to look good in public for a week, but I'd be absolutely relieved. They've said this about narcissistic parents. They've said this about narcissistic spouses. They've said this about narcissistic bosses. But they're saying, because of how the family court is set up in a way that a lot of people have to make the painful decision to stay, because they do not want their kids alone with a narcissistic co-parent. And the family court will grant custody to that parent. So they're like, nope, not doing that. And on their 18th birthday, they file for divorce. Then you have the most complex variable of all, and that's trauma bonding. And the trauma bond is almost experienced as a physiologically unbreakable connection with a person that's created by this intermittent shape-shifting between periods of time that are quite abusive and awful with periods of time that are not abusive. Now, they may not be good. It may just be that this person didn't scream at me today. And in some cases, they may alternate with what feel like good, normal days. We went out, we had a nice time at dinner, we had a nice vacation, and then bam, you're right back in it. And what this does is not only it fosters the hypervigilance, but it creates that intermittent reinforcement slot machine cycle of, well, maybe if I stick in a little longer, it's going to be better. What if I leave and they change? What if I leave and someone else gets the better version? What if I leave and then I'm alone forever? And so that creates this whole cycle that can get immersed in things like, maybe this is my fault. Maybe there's something I can do. And what we know is that there's a human drive, a human need for attachment and relationships. We can't discount that. None of us are saying, I want to be an island. Some people do, but that's not normative. And so this person you've come to know, become familiar with, might even love elements of, or believe you love elements of, represents the person you're attached to. And this intermittent all over the map, when there's sort of cracks in that created by this good, not so good, or abusive, not so abusive, or good, bad kind of sorts of shape-shifting, people tend to blame themselves, because if they blame themselves, they can maintain the attachment. So over time, people in these relationships think they're the bad actor. They're the problem. And you will see survivors in these relationships carrying mountains of self-blame, shame, truly believing that they're a bad person. And so who's going to leave? They're like, I'm the bad one, right? But they know they're not. It all doesn't sit comfortably. As these folks get educated, they're like, oh, this was all the things they were doing were actually not okay. And so that's how people get stuck. And I think one of the big problems, I always say to when I'm training therapists, I'll say, if all you learn from this seminar today is to never utter the words to a patient, why didn't you leave? You do that you're
Yeah,
done. You need to go
for
back
sure.
to school. It is the most
Right.
disrespectful thing you could ask because you don't think they haven't thought about this 1,000 times.
Mhm.
Your job is to help this person feel validated, safe, seen, and heard. And you will get to the reasons they couldn't leave, frankly, very
Right.
quickly. And we want to separate the couldn'ts from the wouldn'ts. Like sometimes they couldn't because there would be these, they didn't want to have joint custody of this child. They didn't trust this person to
Mhm.
raise this child in a healthy way. Sometimes it's because they would lose their entire social support network because of stigmas around divorce. So these things are very real.
Yes.
And it may seem deeply unfair. The whole mess is unfair, but that's how people get stuck.
Right. Right. And so what I'm thinking about is also attachment styles, because you mentioned that, is this sort of a pattern also that, from an attachment style from childhood, and then it's the same attachment style that you have to other people that you have relationships with, or how does
Not
that factor
necessarily.
in?
I think the attachment conversation gets a little reductive here
Yeah.
because I think that what happens is I've seen this time and time again.
Hmm.
Many, many people who are in narcissistic relationships who actually came into this relationship securely attached
Yeah.
in a very good place in their life, content,
Hmm.
lots of friends. But what we forget about narcissism is that narcissistic people can come in hot. They can come in with charm and charisma and confidence, and they're compelling. They're all the things we're told we're
Right.
supposed to be looking for in a partner with the credentials and the this and the that. And
Hmm.
so when someone's coming around and doing all the things that society has told us to,
Right.
it's going to be very rare for person A to go hunting for red flags and B to walk away from that person, right?
Hmm.
So then what we have is that I think that one of the tricky models out there is that the person who gets into a narcissistic relationship is a shrinking violet. They're
Right.
not at all. Sometimes
No.
again, they were in their best place and then they
Hmm.
got sluiced into this whole mess and then they're broken down. And in some ways they become like a trophy that the narcissistic person was able to break down someone who was so much at the top of their game. So while I think that at some level, attachment styles can matter, what we do know from the attachment research is, however, attachment styles are sort of fashioned in childhood, there's a
Hmm.
tremendous body of research with various therapeutic models showing that attachment styles are very, very amenable to modification in the face of healthy, securely attached spaces in adulthood. I have no doubt, though, that especially those with both anxious and avoidant styles could definitely get pulled into these cycles. But oftentimes, these are actually very securely attached people
Right.
who, with intact empathy, intact compassion, are
Hmm.
trying to make sense and say, well, I'm not just going to walk away from someone. That's
Right.
not how you manage an issue like this, not
Sure.
realizing that that might be the only path in town.
Right. So, my next question is then, if you have these people who are at that best place in their life scenario that you just, explained and talked about, how is it that someone who is narcissistic is attracted to them? Because isn't that the whole point, that the narcissist wants to be the one in power, the one in control? Why would they want to be with someone who is in that really good place in their life and maybe, really strong and, doing well, et cetera? I always thought of it as sort of, like the deer that's being hunted, know, like that the narcissist goes, after the sort of the weakest shrinking violet, as you said.
Again, that's another sort of myth in this area.
Yeah.
It's not at all the broken gazelle model, but in fact,
Mm.
the narcissist wants the best gazelle. They want the most gorgeous one, the most successful one. Why? Because narcissistic people want supply and they don't want some namby-pamby supply. They want the best supply, whatever the best supply means to them. So
Hmm.
something about that person was attractive to the narcissist. For grandiose narcissists, it is the person at the top of their game. They want to be part of a power couple. They want
Ah,
the most attractive partner. They want the partner with connections. They
yeah.
want the partner with power because what could feel better than ultimately getting power over a powerful person? That's the
Ah,
top of the mountain, right? Overpowering someone who's easily overpowerable.
yeah.
That's sort of like, that feels like candy from a baby. They're not as
Yeah.
interested in that. Now, there are certainly going to be times when a narcissistic person may put their focus on somebody who is willing to put up with their nonsense, like listen to their sob stories. Some
Yeah.
narcissistic people don't come in so hot. They come in actually kind of victimized and sullen, and life hasn't been fair to me.
Hmm.
But they will be also sometimes very attentive to someone initially. And that kind of victimized, sullen, sort of sad sack failure to launch narcissism is called vulnerable narcissism. These people don't come in as strong. However, people who may have a natural tendency to be rescuers, if anything, the script is flipped. This person who's doing well might meet this person who may some level is attractive to them, but needs to be saved. And that idea of saving someone for someone very empathic, they'll get in. Oh, you could come stay at my place. Oh, sure, I'll connect you with someone who knows that. Oh, let me tell you some of my contacts.
Sure.
And before you know it, this narcissistic person's become a project for them because that's what they do with everyone. It's not that they're foolish. It's just that they're like a fixer. They like fixing people's stuff. They like solving problems. And vulnerable narcissists are a big problem to solve. So I have to say that narcissistic people are very drawn to people at the top of their game because at some level they believe it makes them look good. However, pretty early in the game, the insecurity that is so core to narcissism will get pinged. And piece by piece, the narcissistic person will dismantle the excellence of this person they went after. Like, boy, you sure do need a lot of attention. Or like, gosh, why do you work all the time? Is that because you're insecure? So there's a lot of projection. So now this person who was at the top of their game might stop giving up work opportunities, work travel, friends, all kinds of things like that, so they can stay connected to that narcissistic person. And one day they look up and they're like, whoa, I've kind of taken a step back. But by then the narcissistic person is sort of firmly taken hold of power. And it can even feel like a Svengali-esque relationship where the narcissistic person slowly kind of climbs in there. And the other person might say, well, I love this person. I want them to be involved in what I'm doing. Before you know it, the tables have turned. That's why I'm saying that I think that one of the big mistakes we have is that, oh, they got into this because this person fell into this narcissistic relationship because they're insecure or they caught him at a bad time. Not necessarily.
Wow. Damn, I'm just sitting here thinking about that. I'm thinking about all the people I know. Wow. I have never thought about it in that way. I've always really, focused on sort of the idea that it's somebody who's very weak, who is vulnerable, who is going to be sort of, targeted by someone who is that narcissistic personality. Not at all.
Well, again, why would the narcissistic person want supply that they think doesn't make them look good?
Yeah. So it's all about the supply for them. Yeah.
That's all it is. Every human being is supply.
Wow. And so, okay, let's just turn then to, we kind of skipped over this, but, what are the things we should be looking for if we're worried about getting into a relationship, right? There's so many people who are listening who might be like, I don't want to go there. Like, what are some of the red flags, or are there red flags? I mean, it sounds so confusing right now. What do you look for in a person to say, oh, that person could probably be a narcissist? I need to be careful.
I think one of the challenges is that's actually probably almost not even the right approach. Like the red flag model, I wish it worked better than it does, but there are certainly things that could happen early in a relationship. There may be contemptuous dismissal of something that you're interested in. It might feel like snobbery. It might feel like competitiveness, but by and large, lots of people will frame that as like, it's a new relationship. They're insecure, blah, blah, blah. So we justify it, but you might see that kind of competitiveness, snobbery, almost feels like excessive competitive jealousy. You might see someone who does try to isolate you from sources of support. Why do you have to go out with your friends so much? Like, what's that about? Or they'll even gaslight you and say, well, I guess you're not really I thought you said you're looking for a close, connected, intimate relationship. Like you want to spend all this time here with your friends. Maybe that's not what you want right now. And you actually do want an intimate relationship. So you think, oh, maybe I need to grow up and stop spending time with my friends. And so it's a very slow pulling you away from those validating voices. You might see them really be very reactive when there is some kind of stress or disappointment that's very, very disproportionate. For example, there might be traffic. They may not get the seat they want in an airplane, or their reservation got misplaced. So the person at the front says, we're going to need 10 minutes to find you a table. Anything that might make them feel like they're not special, that they really quickly snap, those sorts of ego injuries. That's another time that you might pay attention, like, ooh, that's a disproportionate reaction. So unfortunately, early in a relationship, those sorts of, if you want to call them red flags, are coming up against a host of green flags. You're having fun. This person might be smart. You might be attracted to them. The sex may be great. The conversation may be scintillating. They may have a very interesting professional life. So you're being carried on that river. So are you really going to notice these other little things, or you're going to rationalize them away? They're very busy. They haven't had enough sleep. How can I hold them? I can't hold them to such a high standard. And so I think it's very hard to pick up. In fact, on average, when I've worked with people in these relationships, they said, when I really started to get that, and if they were fortunate, to be honest with you,
Right.
when I really started to get something wasn't really right here, was about 1 to 2 years into the relationship. Well, 1 to 2 years in, you might be engaged to be married. You might actually be married. You might have a kid on the way. You might have moved in together. You might have intermingled your stuff. So it gets all the more difficult to pull out. People would have to do some pretty egregious stuff early on if all other things seem to be going well. Another thing to look for is inconsistencies in communication. It's not unusual for narcissistic people to come in intensely and lots and lots and lots of communication, and then they may drop away for a few days, right? And what happens is it creates this interesting kind of craving because you've been enjoying the back and forth, the good mornings, the good nights, how you doing? I'll see you this weekend, and then crickets. And for many people, they'll say like, what the heck? And every dating book says, don't question it. You're going to seem needy. Don't ask them where they are. So you don't.
Right.
And then 4 days later, and now you've thought of everything and you've analyzed every text message they've sent you before. And did I say something? And you're looking at their Instagram and are they with someone else?
Yeah.
And 4 days later, they reach out very kind of almost cavalier, like, hey, how you doing? And many people in that situation won't say, why the hell didn't you reach out? Rather, they'll be so overtaken with the relief that this person's back in there, that there is no questioning that this was unacceptable. And they'll be like, and then that person, then you might even get a little hint and they'll say, oh, it's been a busy few days. And that's it. That's all you need. There's no questioning. There's no sense of like, yeah, that didn't work for me. No one, very, very rarely will someone say that. And if they do, the narcissistic person will jump on that and say, whoa, 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 like this is kind of needy, gaslighting the behavior. Then most people will pretty quickly jump into line. So it's really hard to spot this stuff. But I do tell people, pay attention to how you engage in partner choice, focusing on things like patience and warmth and kindness and respect and reciprocity and equality and, and just psychological safety. Right. Those are the things you feel like you can show up as yourself. You can say things that, and not feel like you're going to get shut down. That's what you're paying attention to. But sadly, I think especially dating apps have made this worse.
Yeah.
We're in such a carefully curated dating world. Checklists and is there a picture of them on a great vacation and appearances and all the things. And so people are kind of getting lost in that sort of Instagrammable relationship model or just don't know what to look for because we were never told what to look for. And those things can be hard to find in the beginning because narcissistic people can be so good at showing up initially at what seems like empathy, even though it's not.
Right.
And if they can pull that game off for 8 to 10 to 12 weeks, and then it shifts, 3 months is a long time. And people will say, it must be me because everything was really good there for a while.
Right. Right. And I imagine that if you have grown up with a narcissistic parent or sibling, grandparent, whoever, it's even harder to see those signs, right? Because you're used to them. You're used to those behaviors. Right.
And you've been indoctrinated into that's normal, that's acceptable. And especially since everything you read will say, and it's the kind of true, that big splashy romantic love does sort of start to softly land in a more companionate space. And a lot of people mistake the devaluation for the companionate piece. Does that make sense? So like we think that, so in other words, like over time, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 6 months in, that one thing we see is that we slide from romantic love, which tends to be very passionate and throw you down sex and I can't stop thinking of you, to, hey, I want to sleep late on the weekend and, do we really need to go out tonight? It's not so that, like life starts to happen, right? And it is more, the sex might drop somewhat in frequency. That could be even 6 months in, right? But at that phase, as you go more from a passionate romantic into more of a romantic companionship piece, it's not so splashy. And so people knowing that could be part of a normal relationship structure.
Sure.
When the devaluation cycle starts, which is what happens in a narcissistic relationship, people will say, maybe this is us just settling into the next cycle. The difference is devaluation, which is what we see in a narcissistic relationship, is gaslighting and invalidation and criticism and contempt and lying and all these other things. In a healthy romantic relationship, it's more of the let's stay in. And you're talking more about stuff of life and not sort of the stars in your eyes, you hung the moon kind of stuff. That it goes, you might still think this person hung the moon, but the stuff you're starting to talk about is just sort of the stuff two people talk about in life. Like, again, you just come into more of that. You can't forever be stars in your eye stuff. Like bills need
Right.
to be paid and trash cans need to be
Yeah.
brought in and all of that
Mhm.
stuff. So
Mhm.
the difference, you tell a narcissistic person, oh, we got to bring the trash cans. What do I look like? Your personal assistant? Whereas in a healthier relationship, it would be like, let me go run out there and get the trash cans. Sure, no problem.
Right. And so there's this term that you're using, devaluation, right? And
Mhm.
so explain that a little more, because I think this is so important, because that is sort of something that you can look for
Mhm.
if
Mhm.
you've been in a
Mhm.
relationship for a few months,
Mhm.
6 months, and you're
Mhm.
starting to get serious, and you're at that point where you could actually pivot and say, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, and wake up and smell the coffee,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
explain that a little bit more. I think that's super important for us to talk about.
So narcissistic relationships tend to have sort of a natural cycle to them. In the beginning, we call
Sure.
it love bombing. Love bombing in general is idealization and seduction. Sometimes it's just simply someone saying the things you want to hear.
Yep.
Sometimes it's them being the thing you were told you're supposed to want or you're lucky that you can get. Sometimes it's a person who just wants to spend a lot of time with you. It doesn't always have to be grand gestures.
Right.
Sometimes it's that awning and offing, like it's really intense for a minute, then they disappear, then they come back, then they disappear.
Mhm.
And that backing and forthing can be part of the love bombing. That slowly, somewhere between 6 weeks and 9 months,
Mhm.
enters the devaluation phase, where there is a little bit more sort of the narcissistic person is not nearly as engaged as they once were. They're not as interested. They might be much more willing to say, like I said, contemptuous, snobby,
Mhm.
critical kinds of things. They may be more manipulative. There might be more betrayal or lying. And
Mhm.
this happens gradually. It's not like one
Yeah.
day you're having a
Right.
great time and the next day this happened. It happens gradually. And because it happens gradually, that in the early phases of these more unpleasant things getting kind of scattered in, you're now developing this sort of, this cognitive dissonance is kicking in. Like
Right.
you're like, this felt so good, but these are bad things. Well, that creates a tension that doesn't fit. To get rid of that tension and make the pieces fit, like I said, we'll blame ourselves or we'll justify their behavior. So
Mhm.
in that devaluation phase, I always say it's when the narcissistic person sort of knows they have your supply locked down.
Yeah.
Maybe you said, I love you. Maybe
Mhm.
you're clearly no longer dating other people. Maybe you've even moved in with each other.
Yeah.
Whatever it may be, it's very clear that this is no longer a place of novelty. And that devaluation can last for a while. And then it can slowly enter a discard phase where sometimes the relationship ends. Sometimes somebody, they betray you. Sometimes you leave the relationship. And
Right.
then that can be followed with what's called hoovering. And hoovering is the narcissistic person maintaining control by reaching back in and pulling someone back into the relationship. It's a power play. And a
Uh-huh.
lot of people can misread that as they finally realize the mistake they
Right.
make. They finally see,
Yeah.
but that's the challenge. Now, this love bomb, devalue, discard, hoover cycle, yes, it can happen over many months and years, period, but it can also happen in these mini cycles, even in the course of a day. The narcissistic person might have something great happen to them. They get the
Uh-huh.
promotion they want. They get some really good news and they come home like, babe, you're like the best. I can't believe how great our life is.
Yeah.
And then they might then get a few hours later a call where they're being told, like, yeah, guess what? Like, there's going to be two of you in that job. So you're going to have to bring that salary down,
Mhm.
criticize, manipulate, angry, angry, angry. And then maybe even more cruel, like, God, you know what? You're such a down. And you might be thinking you're still caught up in them swinging you around the living room, babe, I love you. You're
Right.
not knowing this other thing call happens.
Yeah.
And then it turns into something uglier. And then they feel bad because they feel bad. Narcissistic people aren't psychopathic. They do feel bad. Or they can sense that maybe you're pulling away. Oh, babe, you don't understand how hard it's been. And they pull a
Mhm.
person back. And that can happen in an afternoon.
Right. Wow. And so do you think that there are personalities that are more susceptible? I mean, we talked about attachment and you said, let's
Mhm.
debunk that. Because, in Ayurveda, which is, a lot of what this podcast is
Mhm.
about this idea that, we are all born with a different prakriti or genetic disposition with the
Mhm.
three doshas, right? Vata,
Mhm.
Pitta, and Kapha. And they have different personality traits and
Mhm.
different behavioral characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, are there specific personality traits or behavioral characteristics that you have found in your work that are more susceptible to getting into a narcissistic relationship?
I don't think it's the getting in that's the issue. It's the getting stuck. I think we're all vulnerable. I don't think there's any dispositional balance that makes people any more vulnerable. I really, really don't. I don't know a world where people aren't attracted to attractive people.
Sure.
And narcissistic people can be very attractive, right?
Yeah.
So I think everyone in their fashion is attracted to them. It's the stuckness that's the real conversation, right?
Mhm.
Because it could very well be somebody meets a narcissistic person because they're attractive. They go on 3 dates and like, ew, this person just keeps interrupting me. I'm out.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody with those vulnerabilities and all those other things I was saying may not. Now, when we bring it down to personality vulnerabilities, some of the vulnerabilities we see happen most often are things like being very agreeable, amenable, empathic, forgiving, honest, humble, conscientious. These are the folks that are more likely to get stuck. These are people who are going to want to see two sides of a story. They'll take more responsibility. They're just generally nicer people. They're more humble people. They don't need to always be on top. All those things can make a person much more vulnerable to being stuck because they're going to care about the narcissistic person's feelings. They're going to fall for their victimhood stories. And so those personality styles are vulnerable to getting stuck. Don't know that they're more vulnerable to getting in, though.
I think that's a super important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about getting stuck and
The
not
getting stuck that matters, not the getting
Yeah.
in. Getting in, if you can get in and get out after 3 dates, then
Right.
it's no harm, no foul. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's get to the most important thing. What do we do? What are some tactics, some tools, strategies that you could help with or, suggest to the listeners to help themselves start healing from a relationship like this?
Yeah. So if once you're in one, and let's stay with the intimate relationship, because I think healing looks a little different based on the relationship. You got to know what it is. And you got to believe it might be that thing. You don't have to figure out, are they definitely narcissistic? I said, I don't care if they're narcissistic.
Right.
I want you to see that these patterns are showing up and they're showing up consistently and they ain't changing.
Right.
You try this, they still do it. You try that, they still do it. It's almost like you're tracking something, right? And over time you see like, woo, this is a pretty consistent pattern and it is really not me, number one. Number two is the radical acceptance. That's the hardest phase in this. Radical acceptance is the absolute clarity. This is not going to change. Personalities are pretty unchangeable. Narcissistic and other antagonistic personalities are absolutely unchangeable. The less healthy the relationship, the more rigid and the less amenable to change it is. Listen, even an agreeable person, you would be hard pressed to take an agreeable person and turn them disagreeable, to take an honest and humble person and turn them into someone who is deceitful. I don't think you could do that either. So why the hell would we be able to take a narcissistic person and turn them into someone warm and humble and kind and present? We can't. And so they can't change. And understanding that this is not going to change is a very different place to go from, rather than maybe someday, maybe when they retire. No, this is it.
The hope.
This is the hope. That's it. The hope, it has to get extinguished, which is a tough moment because once that happens, we see a ton of grief because there are folks who invested 10, 20, 30, 50 years in the sense of maybe this will get better. And I'll tell you, in the most tragic cases I've seen is when a person who's lasted 45, 50, 55 years in one of these marriages, they get older, they get sick. They think after all these years, my partner will take care of me. Nope. And now 55 years in, after all they endured, they're scrambling, having to find people to lean on, to care for them, to listen to someone's criticisms when they're sick. It is, this person, if they don't like you when you're young and healthy, trust you me, they are not going to want to help you when you're older and sick. So that grief can come in like a series of tidal waves. And like all emotions, negative or positive, it'll run its course. The human species is designed to grieve. And if you hold space for it and call it what it is, you'll get to the other side. After you come through the grief, the radical acceptance becomes even more clear. And at that point, you start really then building up the things you need. Above all else, better social support. You can get through this if you've got the supports around you that you need. And this happens whether you stay in the relationship or not. I'm not saying that the only way to heal is leave. It's not an option available to everyone. So you may stay in it, but you recognize the kind of hollowness that this relationship is. And I often say to people, some acronyms to remember, like don't go deep. When you interact with them, don't defend yourself, don't engage, don't explain, and don't personalize. they're going to be like this with anyone who's in your unfortunate position, for example, of being their partner or family member. Don't defend yourself. They're not listening. They're just going to gaslight you. Don't explain yourself. They're not going to listen to you. More gaslighting. So it means just really disengage. And it becomes a relationship on a need to know basis. But that means you need other healthy places where you do interact. And whether that means cultivating or fortifying the existing friendships or family relationships or relationships in your community or in the workplace you already have. I think that a lot of people, we were sold this bill of goods. Well, your partner is your person. I mean, some people it's not. You have bad luck. You got stuck with this person.
Yeah.
And so you can cultivate that in other spaces. There still will be grief because some people will look around saying, golly, some people have much healthier marriages. They do. Life's not fair. And I think that that sense of injustice does become part of the working through of the relationship. And then it really does become, for example, learning to not share good news with the narcissistic person, learning not to share bad news with the narcissistic person. You really disengage little by little. So it's pretty much keeping the trains running on time. They may still try to pull you into arguments and they will bait you because they want you in it. You're their supply. Right. So if you start pulling, you almost can't pull back too quickly if you're going to stay in it. It has to be a kind of a gradual process. And then the bigger work, and this is the hardest work of all, is in order for us to make these relationships work before we understood what they were, we had to really become subjugated into them. We had to play the narcissistic person's ground game, be what they wanted us to be, which means taking back or even figuring out what your identity is in the first place is the really hard work of healing. That's the tough part because we pretty much had to silence ourselves to be in these relationships and figuring out, who am I? What do I stand for? What am I about? That can be some of the most difficult work. And doing that in safe spaces like therapy or with other safe people, you realize that the narcissistic person actually doesn't deserve to see your authentic self. But that is a part of you that can show up in sort of other places or through other pursuits, creative pursuits, all kinds of things. And then slowly but surely, I have seen people do rather magnificent things once they really got this and go through these steps, but these are not easy steps. And they're made all the more difficult. For example, if a person has a history of trauma, either within the narcissistic relationship or not, it often does mean trauma-informed work to get themselves to a place of stabilization so they can tolerate doing this kind of almost more higher order work. But people get triggered quite often. And many people will say, there are permanent wounds from this relationship. And I say, yeah, there are. And you may trust less. I don't necessarily think you need to forgive narcissistic people, the kind of harm they did, not necessarily. And so I think that people move into a very different kind of future, but a freer one. I mean, in some ways you do have to live in dissonance. You have to recognize multiple things can be true at the same time. Like, this is my mother, I'm making this one up. So this is my mother had a difficult childhood. My mother was absolutely a terrible mother to us. She is selfish. She is cruel. She is sad. I feel sorry for her. All those things can be true of someone at the same time. But the core is that that mother may be harmful for someone. So they have to find a way to interact with that if they choose to interact with it, that accounts for all the pieces. We sometimes want things to be so clear. This is my mother. I'm supposed to love them. I can say it's okay to not love your mother. But I also understand there might be cultural or other duty pulls, but then you need to interact with this mother rather carefully.
Yeah. I mean, it's that delicate balance of holding two things at the same time. And we want to make things so binary. And, in this world, like you were saying, of social media and Instagrammable relationships, all we see is those two extremes, and mostly the extreme of the good. And so we all measure our relationships according to that. So, it's very hard to be in that place of, I can hold two things, two truths to be true at the same time. So, oh my gosh. I'm taking a deep breath. That was a lot. Amazing. And so insightful. I had so many ahas just now too. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this episode as well. Are there any early warning signs that people could look for when they're getting into a relationship? I mean, you said the red flags, but are there any things that is it just really being critical of every interaction that you're having with somebody?
I would say the critical is the wrong word. I would say you need to slow way down. You need to pay attention. I always say to people, I wish I could give people dating homework. Like, how do you feel when you came home? Like, do you feel uplifted, or do you feel a little off balance? Do you feel like you had to work really hard? Like, yeah, maybe in the first few dates, we all feel like it's a little performative, but by date 6 or 7, you still feel like you have to be that performative person. You
Yeah.
need to pay attention. But you got to remember, narcissism's on a continuum from mild to severe.
Yeah.
There are multiple different subtypes. Those subtypes can mix up. So I don't know that there's any straight, clear path into this. I always do say, if a person is getting angry at you when you don't respond quickly enough, like let's say you just got home and you go to bed and you didn't respond to their text that night, and they're like, why didn't you respond? Where were you? Who did you go see? You're like, okay, no. That's a no. That's a hard no.
Mm-hmm.
But some people may still read that as this person is intensely interested in me. And I was upset in my last relationship because they had no interest in me. So
Right.
even something that seems black and white like that, it's not
Yeah.
always. And we'll say, well, I guess I should have responded to their text and not just fallen asleep. But
Yeah.
you should have been able to respond and say, hey, I had a great time. I fell right asleep when I got home.
Right.
And then if the person's like, well, I don't believe you and I'm crazy about you and I can't stand the thought of someone else being with you, that's still a red flag.
Right.
Right. But a lot of people might read that as, oh, I'm flattered because they think I'm off
Right.
with someone else. So I think that I wish I could answer your question equally, because that's the question everyone wants answered.
Absolutely.
But I think it actually means going back a few steps of, what do people even know what constitutes a healthy relationship?
Right.
How often do we date to a standard that we think society wants us to
Exactly.
date to? How often are people choosing partners because their parents tell them that this
Mhm.
is the kind of person you should be with?
Right.
That's really where the mistakes are happening, and where sometimes people can get backed into a
Yeah.
narcissistic person, because what feels safe to us can be slightly different things.
Sure.
Some people might like someone who's very funny.
Right.
Another person may not do well with someone who's
Right.
funny. Funny part's not important. It's that consistent, patient, kind, compassionate,
Mhm.
warm, safe sense. It doesn't mean they're perfect all the time.
Right.
There may be times they get, oh, I'm so frustrated by this traffic, but then
Sure.
they're aware like, but I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm
Yes.
sorry to complain,
Right.
but they're not like cursing and riding
Yeah.
up to people's bumpers and behaving in a way that feels erratic. And they don't react angrily when you point out their behavior, like, hey, listen, we're having a
Right.
good time together. And they say, you're right, I'm sorry. Versus like, don't you tell me how to feel.
Uh-huh.
There are actually a lot of little places that you
Yeah.
can pay attention to this
Yeah.
stuff. And don't make excuses. That's what people do
Yeah.
early on. And then we're like, well, we have to give everyone a chance. No, actually, you don't, especially if
Mhm.
you've been through this before.
Yeah, and it sounds like boundaries. It's like actually also having some boundaries and maybe, setting that up for yourself of like, what are some of my boundaries with other people or in a dating relationship? What are some healthy boundaries for me, or what's an absolute no? That's kind of what I'm also hearing, is
Yeah.
like being a little clear about what's a no for me rather
Mhm.
than what's a no for the world around me,
Correct. And that's a
Right.
hard one. And it's hard. I mean, Matthew Hussey talks about it in terms of standards,
Right.
which is actually a nice way to think about it, because they are standards. It has nothing to do with narcissistic or not narcissistic.
Right.
It has to do with the standard. And you might say, listen, who I am and how I'm wired, if somebody doesn't text me in 2 days, that doesn't work for me. It may work for someone else,
Right.
but there's nothing wrong with me to think 2 days to respond to a message is just too long. And that down the line, this is likely to be an ongoing issue. And then to give yourself permission to say, listen, if my pointing it out to this person is what blows up this relationship, then best to have cut my losses here.
Exactly.
And then to say, listen, this didn't feel okay. In some cases, the person will say, it was absolutely unacceptable. Let me tell you what the last few days were. And then they course correct because you talk to them.
Exactly.
That actually is very promising. But I
Yes.
think, again, especially for women, there's a real indoctrination into this idea of the cool gal. I'm going to be easy breezy. I'm not going to create any problems. And that easy
Right.
breezy indoctrination of
Mhm.
women is a real problem.
Yeah.
And so, no, don't be easy breezy. Be aware of what matters to you. That 2 days might not matter to someone else. They're busy. They don't care. It's not that they're wrong or right, and that you should feel that you can communicate. And I always use the analogy. I love to play cards, a blackjack. But the biggest mistake people do is they're holding a 16 on their hands. A dealer has a 10 up. You assume that the other card that the dealer has down is a 10. They got a 20, you got a 16, you're going to lose. You might as well hit the hand. Worst case that happens is you bust, but you played the hand honestly. Best case is you might win.
Yeah. Love that. This feels like a really good place for us to end our time together. I just have one last question that I always ask all of my guests. If I offer up the phrase to catalyze healing, what comes up for you?
I would say, when I hear the phrase catalyze healing, I would say, in the case of this, having validating voices around you. That's the thing that catalyzes healing. That's the thing that gets it going. For many trauma survivors, one person hearing and believing was enough to start the process of healing underway. For most survivors of narcissistic relationships, someone hearing them and believing them, it was enough to get this process underway. So that, I think it's often just one validating voice in an ideal world, more than a few, so that you have that safe base. We always talk about the secure base as a safe place to explore the world from. If you're lucky, you got it in a parent. For many of us, we have to wait until adulthood. And when we get that in adulthood, it often is enough to start anew in a securely attached world.
Dr. Ramani, thank you so much. I am so honored to have you. I have learned so much from you in the last hour. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight with my audience.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks again for listening to The Healing Catalyst. If you love what you heard, please hit follow and pass it along to a friend. And if you're feeling really inspired, please rate and review so that others can find this podcast more easily. To learn more, head to avantikumarsingh.com. And to connect with me directly, find me on Instagram at avantikumarsingh. I'll be back next week and hope that you will be too. Until then, remember, with the right catalyst, you have the power to activate your own healing, because healing starts within.